There's a person on your mind right now, not a vague memory, not a general sense of someone who used to be present. A specific person with a specific face and a specific voice and a specific way they had of being in the world that belonged entirely to them and to nobody else. A person whose presence in your life was so woven into the fabric of your ordinary days that their absence has not felt like the removal of something extraordinary. It has felt like the removal of something as fundamental as air, as light, as the background hum of a world that made sense. And the silence they left behind is not a simple silence. It is a particular silence, with a specific shape, that arrives in specific moments rather than continuously. Because if it were continuous, you might have found a way to grow accustomed to it. But it is not continuous. It ambushes. It arrives in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday when something happens that you would have told them about. It arrives in the space between waking and full consciousness in the morning before the remembering catches up with the forgetting. It arrives at the dinner table and in the passenger seat and in the particular hour of the evening that used to belong to the two of you in a way that no other hour did. It arrives. And every time it arrives, it has the quality of something fresh rather than something fading. As if the missing does not decrease with time so much as it changes shape, becoming less sharp in some places and more specific in others. Less about the general fact of their absence and more about the particular, irreplaceable, nobody else does this details of who they were. The way they laughed, the specific sound of it, the way they said your name, the particular quality of being known by them, of being in a room with someone who understood, without explanation, the full context of who you are and where you came from and what things cost you that you never have to say out loud because they already knew. That quality of being known is what the silence took. And it is not a quality that can be replaced by the presence of other people. However good those people are, however much they love you, however genuinely they're trying to fill the space. Because the space was not a generic space. It was shaped exactly like the person who occupied it, and nothing else fits. You know this. You have known it since the first day of the absence, and you have been living with the knowledge of it, carrying it through every subsequent ordinary day in a way that most of the people around you cannot fully see. Because grief, after a certain amount of time has passed, becomes something you are expected to be managing rather than something you're still actively living inside. The world around you has recalibrated, has moved forward at its ordinary pace, has filed the loss in the category of the past and resumed the business of the present. And you have learned, because you are a considerate person who does not want to burden others with what you are carrying, to present a version of yourself that matches the world's expectation, to speak about the person who is gone in the past tense, to smile at the memories when they are mentioned, to say that you are doing well, that you are moving forward, that the grief is softer now than it was. And some of that is true, is softer in some places. There are days when the silence is simply a fact rather than an assault, when you can hold the missing without being held by it. But there are other days, and in the honest privacy of your own experience, in the place beneath the managed presentation, you know that the silence is still there, still full, still shaped exactly like the person it took. And nobody has given you permission to say that out loud. So let me give it to you now. The silence is still there. The missing is still real. The grief has not resolved on the timeline the world expected it to resolve on. And all of that is not a failure of faith or a failure of strength or a failure of the healing process. It is the evidence of love. Pause for a moment. Take a breath, because everything in this message is going to build from that foundation. From the simple, honest, completely sufficient truth that the size of what you are carrying is directly proportionate to the size of what you had. That grief of this depth And this persistence is not pathological. It is not something to be fixed or resolved or moved past more efficiently. It is the price of having loved someone completely. And it is a price that, if you were offered the choice again, knowing what the loss would cost, most of you would pay again without hesitation. Because the alternative would have been not to have had them at all. And that is an alternative that does not bear thinking about. I want to talk about the specific ways the silence arrives. Because grief of this kind, the grief of losing someone who is genuinely irreplaceable in your daily life, does not announce itself politely. It does not wait for the appropriate moment. It does not confine itself to the times you have set aside for remembering. It arrives in the grocery store, standing in the aisle where you used to buy the thing they liked. The thing you still sometimes reach for automatically before the remembering catches up. And then you stand there with your hand extended towards something you no longer need to buy. And the ordinariness of the moment, the fluorescent lights, the shopping cart, the complete indifference of the world around you to what is happening inside you in this ordinary aisle, makes the grief somehow sharper rather than duller. It arrives in conversations. When someone says something that reminds you of something they used to say, when a phrase or a tone or a way of laughing surfaces the memory so completely that for a fraction of a second they are present again, and then the fraction of a second ends. And the returning to absence from that brief, returning to presence, is its own particular kind of loss. A loss within the loss. It arrives in your body, not just in your emotions, in the specific physical reality of a nervous system that was built over years of shared life around the presence of this particular person, that learned to regulate itself partly in relation to them, that knew, in a way that was below consciousness and below language, the specific comfort of their nearness, and that now, in their absence, carries a somatic knowledge of the missing that is as real as any emotional experience, a heaviness, a restlessness, an incompleteness that lives in the body as well as in the mind. It arrives on the anniversaries, the obvious ones, the birthday, the date they left, the holidays that were shaped around their presence and are now shaped around their absence in a way that takes the familiar and makes it strange. But also the quiet anniversaries, the ones nobody else marks. The specific Tuesday in October when the light is a particular quality that belonged to a shared moment. The first cold morning of autumn that carries a specific memory. The song, the smell, the unexpected sensory ambush that arrives without warning and departs without resolution. And it arrives in the faith. This is the part one want to sit with most carefully, because many of you who are carrying this grief are carrying it inside of faith that has been genuinely tested by the loss. Not abandoned. You have not walked away from God, but complicated, layered, made more difficult to navigate by questions that faith language does not always address with sufficient honesty. Questions like, where were you? If you're the God, who heals? Why was there no healing? If you're the God who intervenes, why did you not intervene in this? If you hold every life in your hands, why did you open your hands at that moment, on that day, before I was ready, before they were ready, before we had said everything that needed to be said and done everything that needed to be done? These are not faithless questions. They're the questions of a person who took God seriously enough to expect something from him, who believed genuinely enough that the gap between the belief and the outcome is genuinely painful rather than merely disappointing. And they deserve to be named as what they are, not as spiritual failure, not as evidence of insufficient faith, not as questions to be quickly resolved with theological answers that are true, but that do not quite reach the place where the questions actually live. They deserve to be held, honestly, in the presence of a God who is, Scripture consistently affirms, large enough to receive them without being diminished by them. Job held questions like these, loudly, at length, with a directness that makes most contemporary spiritual content look carefully managed by comparison. He did not perform acceptance of what had happened to him. He brought the full, unedited, and censored weight of his grief and his confusion and his theological crisis directly to God and said, I need to understand this. I need you to account for this. And God did not rebuke Job for the questions. He rebuked Job's friends, the ones who arrived with pre-packaged theological explanations for why Job's suffering made sense. The ones who were more committed to defending a particular understanding of how God operates than to sitting honestly with a person in genuine pain. God's response to Job was not an explanation. It was a presence, a drawing close, a speaking from a whirlwind that did not answer every question, but that made the presence of the answerer so undeniable that the questions changed shape in the light of it. That is available to you, not the resolution of every question the loss is raised, but the presence of the one who holds the questions along with you, who does not require you to resolve them before he will draw close, who is not made uncomfortable by the full honesty of your grief. He is in the silence with you. He has been in the silence from the beginning. I want to speak now about something that grief does that is rarely named in spiritual spaces, something that happens in the long middle of loss. After the initial acute phase, after the casseroles and the cards and the community of support that surround the early days of bereavement have dispersed and the ordinary world has resumed, that can be one of the most isolating experiences of the entire grief journey. The loneliness of grieving someone that the world has moved on from. Because the world does move on. Not callously, not without genuine care, but with the ordinary momentum of lives that continue. And the people who loved you through the early days of a loss, who sat with you and wept with you and said all the right things and meant them, those people have returned to the full occupation of their own lives, which is appropriate, which is as it should be, which you would not want to be otherwise. But the effect of it is that the grief, which has not moved on, which is still present and still active and still arriving in the grocery store and in the passenger seat and in the particular hour of the evening, becomes something you carry increasingly alone, something you have learned to carry quietly, to manage in private, to bring out only in the moments when it becomes too heavy to contain, and then to put away again quickly, because you are aware of the discomfort that sustained grief produces in people who love you and do not know what to do with it. And the carrying of it alone makes it heavier than it was designed to be. Grief was not designed to be carried alone. It was designed to be shared. In community, in honest conversation, in the specific relief of being with people who knew the person you lost and who carry their own version of the missing and with whom the remembering can happen without apology or management. If that community has thinned, if the people who shared the loss have drifted back into their own lives and the grief has become increasingly private, I want to say something about that directly. Find the people who knew them, or find the people who have lost someone of their own and understand the specific geography of this kind of absence. Not to perform the grief for an audience, but to speak the name out loud in the presence of someone who will receive it without flinching, to tell a story about them, a specific detailed, this is exactly who they were story, to someone who will listen with the full attention that the story deserves. Because one of the things grief most needs, one of the things that the silence most specifically takes, is the ordinary, daily, unremarkable act of speaking someone's name, of referencing them in conversation, of saying, "Do you remember when they," and having the person across from you say, "Yes, I remember," and "Tell me more." That act of shared remembering is not a step backward in the grief process. It is not wallowing. It is not an inability to move forward. It is one of the most important acts of love available to the living. The act of keeping a person present in language and in story and in the specific, irreplaceable detail of who they actually were rather than the smooth, generalized version that memory produces when it is not regularly refreshed by the act of telling. Speak their name. Tell the stories. Keep them present in the way that the living can keep the departed present. Not by refusing to grieve, not by pretending the loss did not happen, but by carrying the fullness of who they were forward into every day that comes after. Pause for a moment. Take a breath. There is something I want to address about the relationship between grief and faith that I think is one of the most important things in this entire message, because it touches on something that many people carry in private, something that the language of faith sometimes makes it difficult to name openly. The feeling that the loss has changed something in the relationship with God, not ended it, not destroyed the faith, but changed it, made it more complicated, introduced a layer of something. Not quite bitterness, not quite distance, but something in that territory that was not present before the loss. A hesitation, a guardedness, a reluctance to trust fully or hope openly or pray with the kind of undefended expectation that characterized the faith before the loss taught you what loss feels like. If this is true for you, if the grief has introduced a complication into the faith that you have not quite known how to name or address, I want to say something about it that I hope lands with both honesty and gentleness. That complication is not a sign that your faith is failing. It is a sign that your faith is real. A faith that has never been tested by genuine loss, that has never had to reckon with the gap between what was prayed for and what was given, between the healing that was believed for and the healing that did not come, between the God who is described as sovereign and the specific outcome that sovereignty permitted. That faith is real too, but it is operating in conditions that have not yet required it to be more than comfortable. Your faith is operating in harder conditions, and harder conditions produce either the erosion of faith or the deepening of it, depending on what the faith is anchored to. If it is anchored to outcomes, to the expectation that faithfulness produces protection from loss, then loss of this kind will erode it, because the anchor has been pulled up. If it is anchored to the character of God, to the specific scriptural, historically confirmed truth that God is good and present and faithful, even in the seasons when the evidence of goodness and presence and faithfulness is not visible to the natural eye, then loss of this kind will deepen it. Not immediately, not without genuine struggle, but eventually, because a faith that has survived this and remained, however complicated, however layered with honest questions, is a faith that has proven something about its own foundation. Psalm 34 verse 18 says, and hear this not as a theological statement, but as a specific, personal address to you truth. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Close, not distant, not waiting for the grief to resolve before drawing near. Close to the brokenhearted, in the breaking, in the silence, in the grocery store aisle and the passenger seat and the particular hour of the evening. Close, that is where he is. That is where he has been since the first day of the absence. And the complication in the faith, the layer of guardedness and hesitation and honest question, does not change his proximity. It changes your awareness of it, but not the fact of it. He is close. He has always been close. I want to talk now about the space itself, the specific, shaped, person-sized space that the loss left in the architecture of your daily life. Because one of the questions that grief eventually raises, not in the early days when the question of survival is the only relevant question, but in the longer middle when the immediate crisis has passed and the ordinary structure of daily life has been reconstructed around the absence, is what to do with the space. Not in a practical sense necessarily, in an interior sense. What relationship to have with the emptiness, whether to try to fill it or to leave it as it is, or to find some way of inhabiting it differently, of relating to the absence not as a wound that requires healing, but as a space that holds something. I want to suggest something about the space that I think is true and that I think the grief journey eventually, at its own pace and in its own time, tends to confirm. The space is not empty. It is full of everything the person left behind, not their physical presence that is gone, and the honest acknowledgement of its goneness is part of what genuine grief requires. But everything else, the specific ways they shaped you, the understanding of yourself that their knowing of you produced, the particular qualities of love and patience and humor and wisdom and presence that their being in your life developed in you, the things they taught you, not in formal instruction, but in the ordinary, daily, accumulated teaching of shared life. The version of yourself that exists because they existed. All of that is in the space, living in it, continuing to be present in it in a form that the death could not take because it had already been transferred from them to you through years of proximity and love and the specific alchemy of being known by and knowing another person. They are in you, in the ways you love, in the things you notice, in the reflexes of kindness and the habits of care and the specific quality of attention you bring to the people in your life, in the stories you tell and the values you hold and the particular way you see the world that was shaped in part by seeing it alongside them. The space is not empty. It is the most inhabited space in your life. And learning to relate to it as such, not as a wound to be healed or a vacancy to be filled, but as a living, continuing, genuinely present inheritance, is perhaps the most important work the long middle of grief makes possible. John 11 records something about Jesus that is worth sitting with slowly in the context of this message. When Jesus arrived at the tomb of Lazarus, when he stood in the presence of the grief of Mary and Martha and the community of people who had loved Lazarus, Scripture records simply this: Jesus wept. Not, Jesus explained the theological significance of the death. Not, Jesus reminded the mourners that resurrection was coming. Not, Jesus rebuked the grief as evidence of insufficient faith. Jesus wept in full knowledge that he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead, in full possession of the power and the intention to reverse the very loss that was producing the grief around him. He wept anyway, because the grief was real, because the loss was real, because the people weeping around him were people he loved, and their pain mattered to him not as a theological problem to be solved, but as a human reality to be honored. Your grief is real. Your loss is real. And the God who wept at the tomb of Lazarus is not standing over your silence with impatience or theological correction. He is weeping with you. He has been weeping with you since the beginning. I want to give you something now that I hope you will carry out of this message and into the ordinary days that follow it. Not a resolution of the grief, because the grief does not resolve, it transforms, and the transformation takes the time it takes. But something practical, something that honors both the reality of the loss and the reality of the continuing life that the loss has not taken. The first thing is permission to grieve without a timeline. The world will apply one. The world will signal, through its resumed pace, through its expectations of your functionality, through the subtle discomfort it displays when grief surfaces beyond what it considers the appropriate window, that you should be further along than you are. Ignore that signal. Grief has no appropriate timeline. It has its own. And the most important thing you can do for yourself in the long middle of it is to stop measuring your grief against an external expectation and start simply being honest about where you actually are. Where you actually are is exactly where you are supposed to be. There is no behind in grief. There is only the next honest step. The second thing is permission to remember them fully. Not the sanitized, smooth, everything was perfect version that memory sometimes gravitates toward, and that does not quite capture who they actually were. The full version, with the complexity and the imperfection and the specific, irreducible particularity of a real person who was really here. Because the full version is the one that is most alive, and keeping them alive in the fullness of who they actually were is one of the most loving things available to you now. The third thing is permission to receive help, not just in the practical dimensions of the life that has been restructured by the loss, but in the grief itself, whether that help comes through conversation with people who knew them, or through a grief community, or through professional support, or through the specific, sustaining help of a God who is close to the brokenhearted and who offers not the resolution of the questions, but the company of his presence in the place where the questions live. You are not designed to carry this alone, and accepting help, in whatever form it arrives, is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is the appropriate response of a person who understands that the weight of genuine loss is too significant for any single person to carry without support. And the fourth thing, the one I want to leave you with, the one I want to be the last thing this message gives you, is this. The silence they left behind is not evidence of their absence from everything. It is evidence of their absence from here, from the physical, sensory, present tense experience of your daily life. That absence is real and it is permanent, and the grief of it is appropriate and will not be minimized in this message. But here is what the silence cannot take. It cannot take what they deposited in you. It cannot take the love that continues, because love, genuine love, does not end at the boundary of physical presence. It cannot take the specific shape they gave to your understanding of yourself, of relationship, of what it means to be known and to know someone. It cannot take the stories. It cannot take the ways they changed you. It cannot take the version of yourself that exists because they existed. All of that continues, living in you, moving through you into the people and the moments of every ordinary day. They're still here. Not in the way you most want them to be here, not in the way that would make the silence stop, but in the way that love makes presence possible beyond the limits of physical life. And the God who made them, who knew them before you did, who will know them after the last person who remembers them has also gone, holds them completely, in a safety and a wholeness and a continuing that is beyond what language can adequately describe. They are held. You are held. And the silence between you, real as it is, shaped as it is, full of everything that their absence means, is not the final word on the story of a love that was genuine enough to produce grief of this depth. Love of this depth does not end. It changes form, and it continues. If this message found you in the middle of a grief that you have been carrying more quietly than it deserves to be carried, go to the comments and type 999. 999 is your acknowledgement that the love was real, that the loss is real, that the silence is real, and that you are still here, still carrying it, still honoring it, still refusing to pretend that what was lost was anything less than what it was. And then beneath your 999, if you are willing, write their name. Just a name. Nothing else required. No story. No explanation. Just the name of the person whose silence you are carrying. Because a name spoken openly, brought out of the private space and into a place where other people can receive it, is one of the most powerful acts of love available to the living. Speak their name. Let this community receive it. And share this message with someone who is carrying a silence like yours. Someone who has been grieving more quietly than the grief deserves. Someone who needs permission, simple, honest, unglamorous permission to still be in the missing. Tell them, the grief is not too much. The missing is not weakness. The silence is the evidence of something that was worth every day of its cost. You were guided here today, and the person whose silence brought you here, they were worth every word of it. White heart,